his grandchildren, Chad and Crystal Hershner, Autumn, Jay, Christy, Stephanie, Rochelle, and William. Of course, they also had several great-grandchildren as well as several nieces and nephews and cousins. But Bill had a big place in his heart for family. I know he helped out family on several different occasions. And not only that, but there's one thing that stands out. Chad's daughter, Faith, was born just about a decade or so ago, a little longer maybe, but back in 2013, Bill was at a national poultry show in Columbus, Ohio, and there he bought a book for his great-granddaughter, Faith, who was just a tiny baby at the time. And the book was called Cinders, A Chicken Cinderella by Jan Brett. And Bill held on to that book for 2.5 years before finally giving it to Faith at the 2016 Christmas. And I spoke with Faith. She still has the book, as a matter of fact. But inside of the book, Bill wrote this, says, "Dear Faith, this book was bought especially for you because you know how I like chickens. The woman who drew these pictures and wrote this book was there, as she also has chickens. I waited in line over an hour to buy this book from her for you, so I hope you enjoy it. And I waited to give it to you till you were a little older. Love, Great-Grandpa Hershner." Maybe that's a side of Bill, the soft-hearted side that we didn't always get to see. But one of the things I'll say about Bill is that he had a strong work ethic. Solomon goes on in Ecclesiastes to say that there is a time to plant as well as a time to uproot. In other words, there is a time to harvest. But I'm also reminded of the Apostle Paul's words. He says, "Whatever you do, that you need to work at it with all of your heart as working for the Lord and not for men. It is the Lord Christ that you are serving." And so Bill did work hard all of his life, not afraid of the hard work there of keeping the family farm going, at least once he returned from the military. And Bill got up every day for years and years and years to do the morning chores, and I think there were evening chores as well. And I know for a long time he convinced his brother Dean to come out early in the morning to help him. And I think actually Bill continued to do chores up until just the last few years of his life. When you're a farmer, you really don't get time off, and you just have to keep doing it day in and day out. But then once Bill decided to get rid of the livestock and let someone else plant the fields, Bill and Dustin, who was just a young man at the time, they started showing poultry at not only the local fairs but also at some of the state fairs. They made several long trips together, and I know Bill always seemed to be talking about going to this fair or that fair and competing, and they would take sometimes 400 or 500 fowl with them to these fairs, and they won a lot of awards in the process. But in addition to farming, as Dave mentioned, Bill also did some electrical and plumbing work. And when my family and I moved into town back in 1990, we bought an older home. And when I say older, nobody actually knows how old it was. It just said 150 plus when we bought it. But our drain from the kitchen to the main sewer only dropped about an inch over about a 40-foot span. And so it had a tendency to clog up. And Bill would come and help us get that unclogged, and even had to replace part of the old cast iron drain. And fortunately for us, he never charged us a dime for any of that work that he did. And like I say, fortunately, because I don't think I had a dime at that time to give him. But we were very, very appreciative that Bill would come and do that. This building that you are in right now was erected, I believe, in 1967. And it was built by the men and the women of this church. I think that the total cost was somewhere around $55,000 to $60,000, which was a lot of money back in those days. And a lot of the men climbed up into the trusses, putting it together. I believe Bill installed a lot of the plumbing that exists. And not only that, when we had plumbing issues over the years, Bill got to do that as well, and never seemed to gripe or complain about it. And Dave went through a list of accomplishments that Bill was involved in. A lot of the things, like he was president of the PTO for a while, way back when Dan and Mark were in school. One of the things I always found interesting was when he was working or serving with the Morrow County Society for Crippled Children and Adults. And I know Bill had a building there in Johnsville. I think it was an old feed mill or something like that. And he kept a lot of that equipment in there. And so whenever anybody needed a hospital bed, he would take it into their home. If somebody needed a wheelchair or a walker or just a cane or whatever, they were willing to take that into people's homes as well. And so there were a lot of people that were the recipients of that ministry. And really it was a ministry, even though it really wasn't a church-related thing. Also, in his spare time, he served as Perry Township trustee and clerk, responsibility which was shared by his wife Maxine. And not only that, I remember that Maxine had to learn how to run a computer at a time of her life where she really didn't have a desire to do any of that. And I had the opportunity to do some troubleshooting on their computer a time or two to try to get things running a little more smoothly. But I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the 70 years that Bill served as a 4-H advisor. He loved working with the young people of the Johnsville Jolly Farmers and Farmerettes Club, and was even its first president way back when. And it was kind of neat to see Bill being honored this past fair, as they had a booth that recognized the many years of his service, and along with the other 4-H booths there in the building. But one thing that stands out, though, is Bill's commitment to his Lord. I believe that this congregation began meeting in 1961. And I know a lot of these dates because Bill shared them with me, but they were meeting at the Seniors on Center, eventually moved to the Grange building, and that no longer exists here in town. But the struggling congregation, they hired their first full-time minister, Dale Snell, back in 1963. And it was about that time that a few families from the Pleasant Grove Church of Christ decided to come in and to kind of help support the local church here, to try to see if they couldn't kind of get it up and running, become a little bit stronger. And not all those families that came in, they were only supposed to come for a short time. But Bill and Maxine, along with the Snaveleys, were a couple of the families that decided to just stay here and continue to serve. And so for many years, Bill served as a deacon of this church. And about the time that Dale Snell retired, Bill became one of the elders along with Lyle Snavely. And he was also part of the pulpit committee when they were searching for a new minister. And so back in January of 1990, the leadership team had a meeting. I had sent a resume here, and along with several other people, and they decided to kind of check me out. And so that meeting went kind of long into the night, but in spite of Bill getting home very late that evening, it was Bill and Maxine as well as Don White. They did a 3.5-hour drive to Waynesburg, Pennsylvania the next day on Sunday morning, and then they showed up in the church where I was ministering over in that little town. And needless to say, we didn't get a lot of visitors. And so when you get 3 people from Ohio, it's pretty obvious why they are there. And, it just kind of popped up on a Sunday morning. But that was the first contact that I had or I should say the first face-to-face contact that I'd had with anyone from the church here. And then when we finally moved over here in May of that same year, Bill, along with several others, brought their trucks. Bill brought a livestock trailer, loaded up our swing set and some other stuff, and so there was a whole caravan of people that helped us move into this community. A couple of years ago, Bill stepped down from his position as elder. And I can still remember that evening as he came in. He was rather frail, somewhat weak. And as he began talking, he had tears in his eyes and said that because he was finally just realized he was just getting to the place where he was no longer physically able to do that job. And as a matter of fact, he was so weak that evening that we had to physically help him get up off of his chair. And it was a hard decision for him to make, but he knew that it was the right thing to do. A few weeks after that, we honored Bill as well as Maxine for their many years of service to God as well as their service to this church. One of the folks that showed up was Bill's nephew, Ken, his brother Marv's son. And Ken said this about that service. He said, during the service, people talked about Bill and his wife Maxine. Someone happened to mention that Bill could be a little bullheaded when the church discussed changing its culture, such as hymnals being replaced by video screens, the piano being replaced by a band, and you probably didn't know, Bill held some very strong opinions about certain things. I know that's probably hard for you to believe. And it just so happened that I had some pretty strong opinions too. They just generally were on the opposite side of the spectrum. But I think Ken, though, he went on and about that gathering. I think Ken hit the nail on the head. He said, I knew Bill longer than anyone else in that church. He wasn't bullheaded. When Bill changed his mind, it was because it was the right thing to do. He knew the youth was the goal and also the answer. And so I will admit, Bill and I disagreed on many occasions over the years. But the interesting thing is it never kept us from having a good, solid relationship. We could always laugh together. He would tell some of the Billisms. Things like, well, you know what an expert is. An expert is a drip under pressure who lives 50 miles away. Bill also liked to joke around sometimes. He would talk about the length of my sermons. You know, when you're younger, you're scratching for material to try to preach a 20-minute sermon. And then as you get older and you've got more things to talk about, you're trying to cut things away to keep it under 30 minutes, which rarely ever happens for me. But Bill looked at me one day. He says, a lot of times I get done listening before you get done talking. But the fact that we had a lot of disagreements over the years actually kind of became a running joke in our meetings. Whenever we would discuss something and maybe Bill would have one opinion, I might have another, and I'd just finally look at him and say, well, Bill, you know me. You say jump, I say how high. And he would just look at me and say, bull-loney. There was one thing that Bill did that kind of gave us all a little scare. I will say that Bill did communion meditations as part of his responsibility as an elder, and Bill always put a lot of thought into these communion meditations that he did. And I remember I was sitting on the front row. That was back in the days when we still had pews, and Bill brought a bullwhip in. And he just chose to, show everybody how that bullwhip works right in front of my face, and just kept snapping that thing. And I wasn't sure exactly how close he was going to get or what the purpose of that was. But probably the most unusual thing that he did during the communion meditation was the Sunday that he brought in a live chicken. He didn't even tell Maxine that he had brought it. He had kept it in the trunk of the car. And we weren't sure what he was going to do with it. A lot of us kind of thought he was going to kill it, sacrifice and all that. But it did have a point. It was an all-white chicken, one of his show chickens. And the interesting thing about that chicken was it got a champion ribbon down at the Ohio State Fair. And then when he showed it at the Morrow County Fair, it got third. That just seems backwards, doesn't it? But as he held that chicken in his arms, he said there was one little black feather on this all-white chicken that was kind of hidden up underneath. And so he started talking about hidden sin. And he even plucked out that one black feather. But it was one of the most memorable communion meditations that I'd ever heard, and it really did have a great point. The fact that maybe there's some things in our lives that need to be plucked out and gotten rid of. Bill also taught me some things about leadership. And number one is you need to state your opinion when it really matters. And Bill just told me, he says, if I've got something to say, I'm going to say it in the meeting. I'm not going to wait until the meeting's over, then go out and tell everybody else. And I've known a lot of people that would do the latter. They would never say anything until they would go out afterwards, and they'd call their friends and whatnot and complain about this or that. But Bill was going to tell you if he had something to say. And I thought, wow, that makes a lot of sense. But then also, Bill said, when a decision is made, he was going to support it wholeheartedly, whether he was in agreement or not. But that's one of the great things about the elders here in this congregation. We will all share opinions, and we will talk different things about different things. We will discuss them. But once a decision is made, that's what we do. And we're all behind it. And so Ken mentioned the music that changed over the years, and Bill realized that even though it wasn't his thing necessarily, he would look around on a Sunday morning and he would see a lot of young families and a lot of young kids running around here making all kind of racket. And he said, he goes, it's not my thing, but evidently it's somebody's thing. And so that made it a lot easier for him to support. A good lesson for every leader. And then a few months before Bill and Maxine moved into Primrose, I went out to their house and I just chatted with them for an hour or so. And Bill just looked over at me. And I remember these words very distinctly. He said, Doug, we had a good run, didn't we? I'm like, yes, we did. Yes, we did. Worked together for 35 years. As Christians, I believe it's important that we cling to our faith, that we find our strength in our faith, but also that we cling to the promises that we find in Scripture. One of my favorite passages of Scripture comes from John, the 14th chapter. Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. So I go and prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again, and I will take you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And then Jesus went on to say, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. What a great promise. The promise of an eternal home. You know, my wife and I have enjoyed traveling quite a bit over the last couple of decades, and we've got a chance to see a lot of sights. They're just absolutely amazing. It's really amazing to stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon and look at that big hole in the ground. Pretty magnificent. I love looking down into the crystal clear blue waters of the Caribbean. But I will say, one of the neatest things I ever experienced was something that maybe you wouldn't appreciate very much. But we were still living in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania at the time, and we had just a terrible ice storm come through. Power lines went down because of the ice that had collected on them. Entire trees just broke off like toothpicks, sticking up out of the ground. And a lot of people were without electricity for 2 and 3 weeks because of all the damage. But I remember the day after the storm, as awful as it was, the roads were slick. You couldn't hardly even walk on the sidewalks because they were nothing but a sheet of ice. But the next day, the sun came out and the sky was blue. And because of all that ice, everything sparkled. It was one of the neatest sights I've ever seen in my life. The road sparkled, the sidewalk sparkled, every blade of grass sparkled, every tree limb sparkled, everything just shined, reflecting the light of the sun. And so when I think about this promise that Jesus gave to us as well as to disciples, this promise of an eternal home, I kind of wonder if it won't be something like that, but even a lot more. You know, if God was able to create this world in just 6 days, imagine what he's been able to do in the last 6,000 years. I think it's going to be something that will just blow us away. But what a great promise that is, a place where we can go where there's no more crying, where there's no more death, there's no more dying, no more growing old, no more Parkinson's disease, no more cancer, no more spending, no more sickness, nothing. We just simply get to spend eternity in the presence of the Lord. And so I hope that when we come to the end of our lives that we can have the same attitude as the Apostle Paul, who said, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And I think Bill would say that. Not that it was a perfect run by any means, but yet still through it all kept the faith. And then Paul goes on to say, now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. So I think if Bill wanted to share some last words with you, he would say, keep on keeping on, never stop, go all the way to the end. Be faithful. Be faithful. So that we can all hear those words at the end of our journey. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter into my joy. So let's go ahead and bring this service to a close.